Well, welcome to the show, Shad. Why don't we start by you telling us just a little bit about yourself, academically, vocationally, and then we'll take it from there.
Right. Well, my name's Shad Maruna. I'm a professor at the Queen's University in Belfast. I'm not originally from this part of the world, as you can probably tell. I'm a Midwesterner like yourself. I come from downstate Illinois. Was educated in Illinois, Illinois State University, then went on to do a PhD at Northwestern in Chicago, and then I left the U.S. and have been a fairly itinerant academic ever since then. I've taught a number of universities in England, at Cambridge, and at University of Manchester. Spent a lot of time in Liverpool, where we did some of my research. In the meantime, popped back and forth to the U.S. I taught at State University in New York and Albany. Taught at I was a dean at Rutgers University and their School of Criminal Justice for a couple of years as well. So I've been all over, but Belfast is home. It's been home now for a good long time, over a decade anyway. Let's see, you said academic, professional. Most of my professional career has been in universities. I do a lot of work with practitioners, and sometimes there's an assumption that I've done a lot of practice myself. I'm not at all, and I learned from podcasts like yours a great deal about probation work and the real world and so forth. I have had a few jobs in that regard, but certainly nothing that would qualify me as a professional career. Maybe my most enjoyable was a summer I did way back as a probably 21-year-old, did a stint as a graveyard shift at a halfway house up in Alaska. At the time, I had just graduated with a degree in philosophy and English and literature, and had therefore no real world skills to speak of, and had headed off to Alaska like a lot of young people do, looking for work. Wasn't qualified to do much of anything but cut fish, and I'm a vegetarian, so I don't like cutting fish, and so saw the job opening at the halfway house, and learned a great deal. I only got the job because I'm good at staying up all night, which was the only requirement of the work, but ended up coming out of there having great respect for the people who work in that field, but just as much for the individuals in the halfway house, and it probably kicked off some of my interests in this regard.
Shad, I can't tell you how many of my colleagues in corrections, probation, or parole started their careers working the overnight shift at halfway houses. So you've got some kindred spirits there.
Indeed, yeah.
So loyal listeners to the show know that we quite often, almost consistently, go down the desistance rabbit hole. What first drew you to that topic of desistance from crime?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, some life experiences for sure. I think the great thing about desistance is its kind of universality, that I think all of us have desisted from a number of things in life, and we can all relate to it, and I certainly could. From an academic point of view, I mean, when my PhD was in a subject or non-subject called Human Development and Social Policy, which is a hugely broad topic area or multidisciplinary field that meant that I was allowed to pursue all sorts of possible topics for my PhD, and I down lots of different rabbit holes before I got to desistance. I actually, in trying to think, I got to desistance first through I found a supervisor called Dan McAdams, who was one of the sort of the parents of the notion of narrative psychology. Dan was very interested in stories and people's personal stories as being crucial to their sense of personality, their sense of identity. And as someone who had previously studied English literature, philosophy, like I had, and who fancied himself definitely the next great American novelist, never happened. But I was very much drawn to this notion of stories and identity. I also knew I was interested in crime. I found another great supervisor at Northwestern, a guy called Dan Lewis, who pointed me toward certainly the work of Howard Becker and others on stories, but in particular the great book The Jack Roller from 1930 Chicago School. And I ended up doing some small work on the Jack Roller later on in my career. So it was really kind of merging those two interests and delinquency, but also in narrative, that I ended up doing a master's study where I analyzed 25 different published autobiographies of prisoners. And at the time, I didn't know what my hypothesis was. I didn't know why I was reading these autobiographies. But when I did so, the theme that jumped out very loudly and strongly throughout was the notion of redemption and changing one's life. And it was there that I think I came to what I am as a desistance researcher. That desistance was just kind of emerging at that time. This was early 90s. And there was a much talk in the literature. Terry Moffat, Godfredson, Hershey, Sampson, and Lobb, of course, all sort of ended their articles with more research is needed on this thing of desistance. We know it's there, we know it's happening, but we don't really know much about it. And here I was coming a very different angle, not coming from traditional criminology, criminal careers framework, or any of those things from the 80s. But I said, look, I'm finding something here in these stories, in these self-narratives that sounds like it's this process of desistance. And it was there that I became, I guess, a desistance theorist, and then started pouring myself into the criminological debates and research, and found what an interesting concept desistance really was.
You mentioned how it drew you, the stories people that they tell themselves, their narrative. I think you and I have talked about this text in the past here, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, and the hero's journey. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there. It's, again, that sort of path that folks take. And as you said, I found this as well, that the universal themes, or the universal, I'm butchering my language, universality of it, that whether it's weight loss or diet or drugs or drinking, at a certain level, folks can relate to that metamorphosis, which, again, I think then helps bridge that gap to criminality. Although that leads to my next question. So in the United States, we try desperately to adhere to the risk needs responsivity model, but I think the culture is sadly so much more of a containment and surveillance model. With your experiences over in the UK, do you find that there's just maybe cultural differences between practitioners in the US and the UK, that you think the ground is just a little bit more fertile over there for some of these desistance practices to take hold?
It's a real good question, important question. It's partially culture, for sure, but there's structural elements to it too. There was a move in the mid to late 90s in the UK, when I first got here, to try to make our community corrections, your word, American word there, to make it more American style, to make it more punitive. We never got to the point that our probation officers here carry firearms, and nobody carries firearms in the UK. But there was a real attempt to, I guess, de-radicalize probation. Probation traditionally in the UK was always the most progressive, certainly the most educated arm of the criminal justice system. You had probation officers in the 1960s, 70s, 80s who were coming to the position almost always, well, in fact, it was a requirement to have a social work background, but almost always a master's in social work, often with some criminal justice social work in there as well. And this meant, and most of them, there was a kind of a hippie orientation to the job. There was it was a do-gooder's position, like most social work, and people went into probation with the goal of kind of changing the world, or at least an interest in the city and urban renewal and these kind of issues. As I say, some conservative government have tried to do away with that a little bit by decreasing the educational requirements. Now the training to be a probation officer is much shorter. You don't need to have a social work background anymore. There was a hope that you would kind of get ex-service people from the military, police. Former police officers and these sort of things recruited into that work. There was also a big movement to privatize probation in the UK, which failed as an experiment, and now they're renationalizing probation. But for a brief window of about 6-7 years there, we had these community rehabilitation centers that sprung up that were meant to replace traditional probation. So anyway, all this is to say there's definitely a cultural difference, but that culture emerges for a reason. I'm not as familiar with the U.S. situation, but one of the things from my time there was the separation of parole from probation that seemed to have a big impact. Whereas probation offices in the U.S. reminded me of probation work in the UK, and there was similar ethos and so forth. Some of the parole offices I worked with in my time in the U.S., I won't name names here, but some of these parole offices were incredibly punitive in their ethos. I remember one parole chief telling me that her job was to put the bad guys back in jail, and that a good day on the job was when more of her parolees were sent back, and that's where she derived her satisfaction from the work, because she knows that these were people who shouldn't be out in the community. And I was a young academic trying to study desistance and redemption, and I thought, wow, we are speaking different languages here, and that partially this was under a Republican governor and a conservative state, but nonetheless, some of that was that this was an organization that was didn't have the same kind of broad remit that probation does in the United Kingdom, where they're working with to try to be an alternative to incarceration, trying to keep people out of prison. They bring that same ethos to the work they do post prison when they work with prisoners after release that they would doing ordinary probation work.
Yeah, some of the more engaging conversations I have with practitioners when I'm trying to infuse evidence-based practices, some of the retort I get sometimes is, "Hey, Joe, listen, we're not disagreeing with what you and those crazy Canadians are trying to propose, but at the end of the day, I'm all about public safety." Which,
yeah,
getting back to your story, and I'm thinking, well, you're all about short-term public safety if it's just about compliance and returning people to custody for infractions, whereas the desistance champions, we're playing the long game here. I'm about public safety too, but if 95% of incarcerated individuals in the United States are going to be released, then again, you're just playing the short game if it's this perpetual catch and release. And again, I think it's a cultural thing. Even you mentioned, I'm from a more progressive state where there's a requirement for a 4-year degree in social work, criminal justice. But even that, I think part of the issue is we don't really clarify. Even our administrators couldn't agree on our role, so to speak. And could have the same conversation that I just had with you about, what is the goal. So we've kind of sort of change that culture here.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your book, Making Good: How Ex-Convicts Reform and Rebuild Their Lives. When I was prepping for this interview, re-prepping, I should say, last night, I reread this opening introduction that you have here, which I want to share because it is so spot on. If I can find it here, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a part of his own heart? Again, we talked a lot in this podcast about sort of this binary approach that practitioners take, this us, them. In fact, the tagline I end my podcast with every episode is there's no them, there's only us. I just, again, I love that quote because I think it really taps into, again, this sort of black, white, pass, fail, again, sort of binary thinking that folks bring into it. And again, I think that's part of the struggle. So I guess we kind of talked about this, but again, yeah, changing that culture of us versus them and tearing down those walls. Of course, I'm a huge Rolling Stones fan, so when I read that, I went right to their lyric, just as every cop is a criminal and all the sinners saints. But again, I think when we look within ourselves, we'll see again that it's, it's not this binary. I think that the attitude helps sort of objectify the client, and we can disassociate from the client. And really don't have to care as much. Almost like a self-defense mechanism.
Yeah, I think one thing that can really change that us and them narrative is this emphasis we're certainly seeing in the UK. I'm not sure how much. Well, I know, and at least in parts of the US, this movement toward lived experience and experts by experience, credible messengers. They go by a number of different names, but this is an old idea of hiring paraprofessionals who themselves have experience of the problem you're trying to solve. So if you're interested in curing folks with addiction, curing isn't the right word, but supporting people to recover from addiction, you need on your team individuals who have had that addiction and have recovered to act as role models and support staff, and likewise with criminal justice, where we're finding that the quote I always like here is that reintegration is a minefield, and how do you get through a minefield? You follow the person in front of you, and if they get through it, you know that way is the safe way to go. And so we're increasingly meeting in conversations around criminal justice folks who have got this justice experience, and I think that does such wonders in terms of humanizing the individual, the subject, what we used to call the offender, and it says, these are human beings just like us. I was incredibly lucky when I first started teaching at the University of Albany, my first job back in 1998. I was going to say through total luck, but it wasn't luck, because Albany had folks like Hans Talk and David Dufay who went out of their way to recruit students who did have criminal justice backgrounds. And in my very first PhD seminar, I had two individuals in the class who came out of the closet in the first week and said that they were former prisoners. One is a guy named Tom, to a great and incredible research career, and having those voices in the class completely changed the dynamic and the narrative of the tone and tenor of our conversation. It made that class still my best ever class. I mean, it's usually you never forget your first class, but so many of my ideas now still today came from those two students, but also the other 12 students in the class, because their presence raised our conversational level so much. And I owe a lot those conversations. And I think the same model can work on a kind of national scale whereby involving lived experience individuals in probation work, parole work, these sort of things it almost forces us to recognize the humanity, the potential, that here was somebody who was on the other side of the desk, and now they're on this side of the desk. That means the next client I'm working with is a potential future probation officer, and I think that's so crucial.
Yeah, I just love that approach too. I could spend all day talking about your book, but I want to talk about chapter 5. You mentioned this a little bit earlier when we were talking about narrative therapy. So for somebody, say, who may consider themselves a strong risk needs responsivity champion that knows nothing about desistance or identity, talk about the importance of the client's self story and how that's tied to their desistance, and how we really need to not just recognize but tap into that, and even leverage that for desistance to occur.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I've often heard, and not just from RNR folks, but from practitioners, even many academics. I've heard, this notion of identity and narrative. It's so abstract. It's so out there, and to a degree, it is. It's certainly an academic concept. But when you think of the other concepts we work with in our field, risk or propensity or these other things, they're just as abstract. You can't see risk or propensity and all these things. I remember. I hope you don't mind the anecdote, but I had a conversation once in an academic meeting, and there was I was given this critique by a guy who happened to be from the University of Cambridge, our kind of Ivy League in the United Kingdom, and he said, look, there's this notion of narrative identity. What does it even mean? Nobody knows what it means, sort of thing. And I explained it to him. I said, you work at Cambridge. Cambridge is in the business of identity formation. The reason people, and I say this as someone who sent my daughter to Cambridge, someone who worked at Cambridge for 5 years. I love the institution, but 90% of what the institution does is identity work. People are desperate to go to these Ivy League universities because they want to be the type of person who went to Harvard or Princeton or Yale, and parents will pay enormous amounts, legally or illegally, to get their children into these universities for that reason. This kind of status and hierarchy that comes from the elite institutions, and likewise our criminal justice system. We deal in identity and status much more than we say we're in the risk reduction or providing safety and security. Maybe, although these things are hard to measure and they're pretty abstract, but we're definitely in the business of changing people's statuses. The great book Deva Pager on called Marked, looking at the criminal credential. We in the criminal justice system, our currency is status degradation. We are in the business of giving people stigma or obstacles to overcome, and negative labeling of their personalities and their identity, and that's fine, as long as we know that's the work that we're doing. Once we become aware of that work, we can also recognize, well, we could be in the positive labeling business as well. We could be in the business of handing out redemptive criteria, credentials, in the same way that we are in terms of our negative criminal labeling.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. I stumbled across a speech you gave, a positive psychology of imprisonment, down in New South Wales, Australia, but you really dug deeper into what you were sort of touching on there, of how there's these various steps, and you lay out 6 steps of transformation, and how, again, we're sort of doing this in this crazy, bizarro world in reverse in the criminal justice system. But, the steps were essentially, number 1, the apprenticeship or the journey. 2 would be the ceremony. 3, the credentialing that you just mentioned, and then the renaming of the individual, inclusion within an exclusive subculture, and then their own internalizing or self-labeling. And when I've ran with this and presented on this, I think of and I know you do too, other entities that use these 6 steps to great effect. And you mentioned universities do it. And again, if you think of, well, staying on universities, fraternities do this, where
Yeah.
you've got to go, you've got to go through all of these steps here. The apprenticeship and the journey, like the hazing week and the ceremony and the credentialing. You're now a member of Delta, whatever, and the renaming. You get your fraternity name, and then you're part of an exclusive subculture, and then you self-label and see yourself as a frat boy. Or I could go on and on about the Navy SEALs do this, the FBI does this, attorneys do this, or going through law school and then now I'm an attorney kind of thing. But as you said, and I can let you speak to this, in the criminal justice system, we sadly do this in reverse to drive folks into criminality through arrest and conviction and the labels we give and the term offender and all this kind of thing. And so when they see themselves in that exclusive subculture, it's the criminal subculture. And then they internalize that, and then that's their identity. So again, you touched on it briefly, but let's maybe talk about how some examples of how we could use this same 6-step formula in reverse, and how some agencies, I know in France, they have experimented with some sort of graduating, if you will, back in the same courtroom the individual was sentenced in. But yeah, maybe talk about how we could operationalize these 6 steps towards desistance instead of towards persistence.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, the argument, and maybe you can link to the talk that I probably said it better there than I will here, but we can, I can do my best anyway. The argument is, we as I said before, we're already in the labeling business, and we're actually really good at it. Those 6 steps, as you say, are things that universities, all these other organizations you mentioned, have perfected over centuries. And the criminal justice system probably does it better than almost any other, in terms of our status changing. The person who has never been through the justice system versus the person who goes through the justice system, I mean, they do come out transformed. As you say, unfortunately, the transformation isn't a positive one. They have come out worsened, hardened, a more burdened person, no doubt. So the argument is, we can learn from our expertise that we've already got, and you mentioned those different pieces. I mean, the apprenticeship, I'll start with. So if I wanted to create people who were plumbers, the first thing that I would do is to identify professional, seasoned, experienced plumbers, and expose these young people, my blank slates, to them, because you don't just become a plumber without ever having met other plumbers. So this is the apprenticeship process, and then we do it in every field. There's no field that doesn't use this, except maybe rehabilitation. When we want people to become rehabilitated ex-offenders, reformed ex-offenders, whatever that is, we don't have them mix with other ex-offenders, because that would be a violation of their parole conditions and these kind of things. So we expect them to know how to be a reformed ex-prisoner in a magical sort of way, by looking at us. Look at the role model of your probation officer or your parole officer. Well, possibly, but often the parole officer comes from a different ethnic background, a different social class, a different walk of life, a different neighborhood and community, and these sort of things. So we need that credible role models for people. The next part, I got very interested in the notion of rituals and so forth. As you mentioned, we do rituals well in criminal justice. If you look, I like to travel the world, obviously, and whenever you go to a new city, and you're trying to figure out, what's that gorgeous building over there? You can almost bet someone will say, oh, that's the courtroom. Our courts are these incredible, like churches of sorts, a secular version of our temples and our churches. And this is to say that the law is sacred. Our law is to be put you in awe. You're to see the majesty of the beauty of the law. So you have these incredible facilities to do, for the most part, at least in the criminal courts, degradation ceremonies. But we don't have those kind of facilities. When you think about rehabilitation, it's often done in a schleppy sort of office like this. You're sitting on a folding chair and drinking coffee out of a paper cup. We don't have temples of rehabilitation like we do degradation, and that speaks volumes. So we don't ritualize. When my students picture what punishment is, some of it is going way back into the dark ages, sort of stockades and whips and these sort of things. But we were good at the spectacle of punishment. Whether now it's more going to prison, having the criminal trial and these kind of things. But when I ask them to picture what rehabilitation looks like, we don't see it as much. We can't imagine that outside of things like Alcoholics Anonymous, which always got ritual, which has the token economy, which has the celebrations and the sessions and so forth. Outside of that, which has had a huge impact on prisons, we don't really know what rehabilitation is or looks like, and that's because we don't ritualize it well enough. The credential, then, you mentioned. Again, we're really good at the criminal credential. We have intricate laws on how you could maybe expunge your criminal record, because we know that from good research that criminal records have a big impact on a person's life chances and their ability to do everything from getting a license to cut hair to taking your kids on a field trip as a chaperone, or these kind of things. Your criminal record is a hugely powerful credential, and obviously a negative one. Can we come up with rehabilitative credentials that we could give out in the same way? There are certificates of rehabilitation, certificates of good conduct. In most states, these are difficult to receive. You often have to be middle class and educated and know your way around a court system in order to get one. Can we make these more widely available to the ordinary ex-prisoner who has turned their lives around, who is desisting from crime? Can we certify this and credentialize it so that when they go to apply to become a taxi driver, they can say, yes, I have a criminal record, but more recently, I have a certification that I am desisting, and in whatever form that would take. These kind of important steps, they would lead to things like the latter stages. The social inclusion is something we already know a good bit about. We know that people who are employed, who are integrated in networks of pro-social folks, whether that's church groups or Alcoholics Anonymous or marriages and families. If people have community ties and so forth, they're going to be more likely to desist. And then that final stage is the one we want everyone to get to. We want people to change, have that change of heart, take on this new identity. Well, that doesn't just happen. You can't just say to them in prison, change who you are, change, quit being a bad guy and be this new guy. You have to go through these rites of passage. You have these stages to make that change, or else it's just fake it till you make it. It's just you can pretend you've changed, but to really reinforce that change, you need those other 6 steps.
So as to that final step of identity, we know from the desistance literature how big identity plays in that. I'm sure it was originally inspired by you, Shad, but I've made it my goal in life to correct everybody I come in contact with who uses the term offender, and just preach justice-involved individual or client or what have you. Talk about really how important that nomenclature is when we just throw that term around, offender, without really realizing the impact that it has when we're taking, as I often say, the worst thing that someone did on the worst day of their life, and then
Mm.
labeling them that for the next 5, 10, 20 years,
Yeah, yeah.
and how detrimental that is to then what we're really trying to do, which is to get them to desist.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, no, it's hugely difficult. And very important. I certainly didn't. I wasn't the first, but I'm occasionally credited with that. Certainly in the British prison system, there were people who have said that it was me that got them to stop using the term. They haven't stopped entirely, but in official correspondence and language, they're trying to change it. I mean, the prison service used to go under the heading of something called the National Offender Management Service, NOMS, until recently. So this is a big change for them. They now use the phrase the men in male facilities rather than prisoners. You talk about the men, this and that, and everyone knows what men means, prisoners, but they try to stop using that term as well as offenders. I only bring this up to say that I was recently given a talk in New York, funny of all places, and one of my slides had the term offender. It was in quotes. It wasn't something I was using. And somebody in the chat, this is the new world of giving lectures online, was deeply offended by my use of the term offender. So it had come full circle in a lovely way. This was probably a person who wasn't born when I started in this field back in the 90s, when it was a very, very different field. Anyway, to a degree, these kind of language games, the political correctness, can be tedious, and it can be frustrating because we all slip, and we need a sense of forgiveness, instead of a kind of I mean, I don't want to get into cancel culture and all this, but I'm not of the type who, if I catch someone using prisoners or offenders in their language, I jump down their throats. But the reason for what is sometimes called people first language, so people in prison rather than prisoners, or people. The latest one that I like a lot are people with convictions, with the double meaning that phrase has. People with convictions is a mouthful, but the reason it's so important is because, well, it reminds us every time we say it that we are talking about people. Whereas when we use the term offenders, it does it, and especially to use it when we're talking to or about real people, it implicitly, explicitly, subconsciously, and even consciously it tells us that what we're dealing with isn't a person, it's an offender. And an offender, there's no two ways about it. The term, yes, it's a factual term. It refers to something someone did in the past, but it also sounds like it's a label of who the person is. And if we're using it to describe them, all the offenders stand over there. It is, it becomes this kind of, what do they call it? A master status. You're no longer just a construction worker who committed an offense. You are an offender who happened to work in construction. The new master status for you is the offense that you did. And that's from an identity standpoint, from a narrative standpoint, is an own goal, to use a British expression, and although soccer's over there. Why would we want people to internalize the label of the thing we're trying to get them to stop being? It would be better to call them almost anything than offenders. Yeah.
Just you mentioned NOMS, which I'm familiar with, and just to allow you to relate over here, I work in Minnesota, and our prison system, our Department of Corrections, as you know, every resident, they get their sort of internal social security number, their prison identification number, and it's still officially known over here as their OID, their offender identification.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
The struggle is real. Hey, let's talk about your groundbreaking documentary, Road from Crime. You are one of the folks behind that great film along with Fergus McNeil and Stephen Farrell, to name a few. Walk us through the chronology of how that came about and what that whole experience was like for you and your team.
Yeah, great. It was well, the origins of it, going back now, I suppose, 15, 13 years ago or so. Um, we Stephen Farrell and I had both done our books on Desistance. They came out just a couple of years from each other. Written independently, come from different perspectives, but largely reached complementary conclusions, similar conclusions in the two studies that we did. And so we were increasingly in demand is probably too strong a word, but along came a guy called Fergus McNeil, and I know he's a friend of yours and a friend of the podcast. And Fergus, unlike Stephen and I, is a master communicator. He's a former probation officer himself. He's one of life's just magnetic characters, and he discovered the work that Stephen and I did, and he I want to say went on the road, but he became very in demand as a speaker, a kind of translator of the Desistance work. So it was in combination of our own work and then Fergus's knowledge translation. I don't know if that's still the word people use. Sometimes they use the phrase, it's basically taking academic work and popularizing it is what I'm looking for. Eventually, there became so many requests from groups because Desistance has implications across so many different fields, whether it's youth justice or the community corrections, certainly prisons, outside groups as well. There became such an interest and demand in this that we said, how often are the three of us, and there were others involved, as say Claire Lightower, Alan Weaver, who became the star of that film. Anyway, how often are we all going to be giving these talks? Why don't we put it all together in a kind of package that we can deliver to people? If they say they want the Desistance story, they certainly don't want to read a bunch of academic books and articles. How can we package it in an easily digestible but serious and evidence-based way, and documentary was the obvious solution there to that problem. It was a fascinating world to get to know. The documentary filmmaker is very similar to academic work in lots of ways, but in other ways, it's far more difficult. With us, the example I always give, to be an academic researcher, you carry around a cheap digital recorder. These days, it's on your phone. You sit down and you interview people. With a documentary crew, you've got the lighting guy, you got the sound guy, you've got the camera people. Obviously, you have to get all these consents. You get people done up in terms of clothing and makeup and all this, and it's an ordeal. But ultimately, it's the same kind of storytelling, story collection that goes into research. But then the output, of course, is so much more. I want to say digestible. It's the difference of you're putting a face to your data. We oftentimes, the struggle of the writer is to, I witnessed this amazing thing, or I heard this amazing story from this person, but it's coming across two-dimensional, one-dimensional on the page. It's not coming to life on the page, and the great writers, of course, can bring it to life. But with documentary, you can go right there, and we had the benefit of working with Alan Weaver. He's the kind of perfect story. He's an ex-prisoner, did a good deal of time in Scotland for a variety of violent and non-violent offenses. But he's certainly a person first, not an ex-prisoner first. He's now a probation officer, or he had a long career in what's called criminal justice social work in Scotland, which is their equivalent of probation. A journey that isn't common. It's not easy for someone to become an actual senior probation officer as he was. With his background, but again, Weaver is a bit like McNeil in the sense of if anybody can do it, Alan can, and he has this incredible persona and persistence and personality that he was perfect on film, because he could convey so much just in being Alan that we almost don't need to do the interview, the talking heads, the academics, and all this, because his story is so compelling. But we do in the film, and we get in John Laub, we get in Stephen, and Faye Taxman was a big help throughout the making of the film. And Faye brought us to the U.S. and brought in the U.S. aspects of that film, so I can't forget Faye as well, and several others. And the idea was, once we have this now, we can send this anywhere, and the film has, the great thing, we put it online, so we don't even know who all has downloaded and used the film, but of the places we know it's been used in Argentina and Chile and elsewhere in South America. It's been used in Singapore and Japan, and it's translated into like 7 different languages. So the film has legs. It hasn't ended the invitations for us to speak. We still get stretched, especially Fergus, all over the globe. But at least it says if we can't be there, and none of us have been able to during COVID, at least we can send people to the film, and it can give a real decent summary of the Desistance research and theory.
Yeah, it's a great introduction to the topic. I've screened it for so many practitioners and students. And you mentioned the beauty of film, and at one point you used the word digestible. And honestly, Chad, that's why I got into the podcast business, because I don't mind sitting down with a cup of coffee in front of my fireplace and reading an academic journal out of Federal Probation Journal or Scottish Center for Research and Justice or NOMS or whatever. But I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. But they'll sit and listen to my podcast, or they'll watch a documentary film, or they'll watch some silly YouTube video I put up about desistance and identity. So it really is just about getting it out to the masses in a form that they can relate to. It's really responsivity, now that I think of it. People are just going to respond to that medium differently than they would, like I said, a PhD dissertation or something along those lines. Any current or future projects you're working on, Shad, that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. My current 24/7 obsession here is going to be no surprise to anybody. I'm now in the COVID business, like everyone else. We just got a big grant to look at the COVID response in British prisons, I should say English and Welsh prisons, the biggest prison service in the United Kingdom. The motivation for that is obvious. The pandemic hasn't been as devastating in the UK as it was in American prisons and jails, certainly early on in the American experience. But it has led to a very dramatic overhaul of the daily regimes in British prisons. So you've got most British prisons have been on a kind of 23-hour lockdown for months on end here, and visits have been canceled. We now have video visits in many prisons, not all prisons. access to everything, whether it be drug counseling, rehabilitation, using the telephone. Everything has been dramatically curtailed. So it's a huge natural experiment, essentially, in solitary and isolation that we're seeing around the globe. And so it was important for us to get in there. What's most interesting to me and to this podcast probably is the way we're approaching it. We use this as an opportunity to do our first ever study with a group called User Voice, who make more than a cameo in the film that you mentioned. User Voice was started by an ex-prisoner called Mark Johnson in the UK, and their vision was well ahead of its time. The kind of lived experience vision, but it was one of not just user involvement, but user led. That prisoners and ex-prisoners should bring their expertise from their desistance journey to the very top of the leadership and corrections. And Mark and his group have now been going over 12 years, I think, maybe 11, where they've been able to do this, maybe more than that. My memory's gone here with COVID, but they've been able to have a lot of success. Well, most importantly, they run things called prison councils, and about a fifth of the British prisons, which are like a school council. You've got an elected group of prisoners who are play a sort of consultative role where they are listening to the other prisoners' complaints and concerns and bringing those to the management in a solution-focused way. The organization has wanted to get more into research world. They've done a huge number of consultations, and they've contributed to lots and lots of research projects over the years, but again, true to their name, they wanted to get into kind of leadership where they were doing setting the agenda, designing the studies, and not just helping out as consultants to studies. And so this was an opportunity for them to really enter those kind of big leagues in terms of research projects. And I was delighted that they wanted to work with me on this, and we've had a really interesting collaboration so far.
You used the word opportunity a couple of times in your response there, Shad. And since we've gone down the COVID path here, something that I've also been looking at is, and not just me, I've used this expression, from crisis comes opportunity. So I think one of the things you mentioned, just sort of from the prison jail institutional standpoint, changing of doing business, but I think it's also forced agencies to look at the role of the probation officers. Specifically, I think of their traditional role of client contacts.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're realizing, okay, let's measure the efficacy of me driving, particularly if you're in a rural area, half an hour to see somebody, to knock on their door just to ensure that they are home and still live at their residence, versus, oh, I did a Zoom or a teleconference or even a phone call with somebody, and I went through this cognitive behavioral exercise, and I realized that, oh, I'm getting more bang for the buck if I'm sort of fine tuning, or I'm targeting my interventions more, versus just we're realizing almost the it's the word I'm looking for, just the face-to-face contact. There's not much value added to that. But again, historically, and we've come full circle now, because now we're back to social workers versus law enforcement officers. Historically in this country, a lot of POs just thought their job was, again, knock on the door, make sure they're home. And if they knock on the door on a Saturday or a Friday night at midnight, then they're really a good probation officer. Versus, again, I don't need that. I can just, again, do some of these evidence-based practices in a more targeted way with technology. But it's the pandemic that's forced us to do this. We wouldn't have gone there if it wasn't for the fact that, well, POs can't do physical home visits anymore unless they're going to shout from the curbside, type thing. So again, I can't imagine now when we go back, knock on wood, that whether it's prisons or probation or parole officers, they won't carry some of this learned these learned practices with them, because again, they've realized, oh yeah, it's forced us to do these things.
Yeah.
But for the better. Yeah.
No, I mean, the thing about crises is, no question, things are going to be different as a result of this. Whether we're talking about corrections or we're talking about anything, meetings, the way we do universities, the way we do everything is going to change. The question is it going to change for the better or the worse? And I'm definitely, it can seem cynical and maybe even dangerous at some level. This notion of what's the phrase that's become infamous? Never don't. What is it about a good crisis? Don't forget to you can edit it. You always take advantage of a good crisis or whatever the phrase has become. But the truth is, again, I'll speak to prisons rather than probation over here. But the prisons are going to be different when they come back. There's already talk of some leadership, certainly in the probation officers union, the POA, this 23-hour lockdown has worked well. There's violence is down across the institutions. We no longer have the kind of the threat. Well, of course you would, because everybody's locked down. But they're going to look to use this as an opportunity to change the practices. Others will use it as an opportunity to cut budgets and cut staff and these sort of things. So everyone is going to be jockeying to say, okay, there's been this huge pause. We're now going to reinvent when we start up again. And so it's incumbent upon researchers to say, okay, we have to join this conversation and use this, whether it's, now's the time to talk about decarceration, or now's the time to talk about smaller prison facilities. Now's the time to talk about alternatives to incarceration or what have you. It is definitely that kind of moment. So we're glad to be joining that conversation with the kind of user-led voice in the project that we're doing.
Yeah, as my friend Glenn Tapia would say, I'm going to choose to be relentlessly optimistic and hope that this is all for the better.
Yeah. No, it's a good choice. Yeah.
Shad, I'm going to leave a link to The Road from Crime in the episode description of this podcast, and I'll try to track down the YouTube video of the speech you gave in Australia with the identity steps, because again, I found it fascinating. If we could again sort of operationalize that, that would be great. Shad, I can't thank you for enough for joining me. Promise me you'll come back, and thanks for being a fan of the podcast.
Definitely. I will come back as a listener, if not a contributor. Definitely. I love what you're doing here, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Good enough. Thanks, Shad. Have a great day.
You too.